And we've been studying Jesus' hillside message called the Sermon on the Mount. It's found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Hopefully you've been reading it and have read on. We're reading through the book of Matthew together this month while we're studying this. And if you've been reading it, you've seen what Jesus is showing us is a new way to live. We don't actually have to live all stressed and anxious all the time, trying to force our ways. Instead, we can connect to this divine flow of life that's available to anyone. This way where your soul finally feels at peace with the universe, and where God's kingdom kind of life can actually flow into us and then through us. And we access it by confidence in Jesus. And as we put our confidence in Jesus, as we become his friend, as we take him as our leader, then we actually are able to conspire with him to subvert evil with good. And this new kind of life is so radically different from what's normally done, like Jean Valjean discovered. It changes everything. But it doesn't come by our religious observance, by trying to prove that we will do all the right things, or trying to prove that we are good enough to be worthy of love. Jesus is talking about how it comes by a heart that is so willing and seeking God's kingdom ways first. A heart that's overtaken with God's love and goodness, so that it actually infuses this anti-venom into the poisonous ways of human life. And today we're picking up looking at Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, which actually ends with what we call the golden rule, right? You know it, do one to others before they do one to you. Now that's not it, is it? That's how it's often interpreted, but that's not actually it. And actually, this has been common way before the time of Jesus. It's something that God has put into the hearts of humanity. In fact, in 1500 BCE, God says this to Moses, Leviticus 19:18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor the way you love yourself. I am the Lord. And God has put this in our hearts. In fact, it comes out in all the cultures of humanity. And so you see it coming out oftentimes in the negative, the easier negative form. So around 500 BCE, Confucius in China said, never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. Or in Egypt, about the same time, saying said, that which you hate to be done to you, do not do to another. Or in ancient Greece, about 500 BCE, do not do to your neighbor what you would take ill from him. So it's usually found in this negative form of don't do harm if you wouldn't want to be harmed in the same way. But here in this hillside message, Jesus turns it back to its proactive, more difficult, positive form. So in everything, it says in Matthew 7:12, do to others what you would want them or have them do to you, because this sums up the law and the prophets. Love your neighbor the way you want to be loved. Jesus says that sums up every command that God's ever given. Okay, pretty simple then, right? And since we've all known it for all time and all cultures, and we would all nod our heads and go, yep, that's the right thing to do, why don't we do it? Why, since we've all known and we all agree, why is it so hard for us? That's what I want us to ask ourselves today, to really take a hard look at. What keeps us from living out the golden rule? You know, I had a chance to take my son to Washington, D.C. not too long ago and see the famous monuments and memorials. We went to the famous Lincoln Memorial, which is incredible. If you've never seen it, you know, it's this like little mini Greek Colosseum looking place. Very cool. You have seen it, actually. It's on the back of every penny, right? Tails. That's how we memorialized Abraham Lincoln, our most famous president. Heads you win, tails you lose. Kind of weird. But anyway, we were at this, and you know, it's by all the famous war memorials, and it memorializes the bloodiest, most horrible conflict in American history. The war against ourselves. When Americans fought Americans, 620,000 Americans lost their lives. Friends against friends, brothers against brothers in some cases. And as I was looking at it and I was showing my son the inscription on the wall, and we read Lincoln's second inaugural address where he quotes part of the passage we're going to look at today. It's very important to see the irony of what he says, because there's something to learn about human nature in it. Look at what he says. Lincoln said, neither party expected for the war the magnitude or duration which it has already attained. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God and invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance for wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. He was referring to slavery. But let us not judge that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. You know, as we stood reading that, it just struck me again how blind we can be. You know, and looking back, I mean, history has judged that a lot of the reason for the war was slavery, and it's pretty clear that economic gain was the motivating factor for enslaving a race, which, you know, was self-serving and wrong. But as Lincoln pointed out, both sides read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and judged each other as the evil side. And I thought about how common this is. I mean, in the Middle East, in Ireland, in America, but beyond that, in every office, right? In every social group, in every high school, in every home. We struggle in this way. And that's why Jesus is going to very wisely show us what keeps us from living the golden rule. So let's take a look at Jesus' words where he starts, and let's let it be a searchlight on our own hearts today, okay? So Matthew 7, verse 1, do not judge, or you too will be judged, Jesus said. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. All right, so Jesus says, don't judge. And we say that to each other all the time now, right? Hey, don't judge. And we would all say, we know being judgmental is wrong. We detest judgmental people. We know that's wrong. And in fact, I would bet most of us would give ourselves pretty high marks on the non-judgmental scorecard, right? And yet the reality is, if you're anything like me, you can be blinded to it and not even realize that we subtly judge each other, and it keeps us from loving others the way we would want to be loved. It's very subtle, but we're amazingly good at this. Let me just give you a little test, okay? Have you ever had subtle thoughts like, I can't believe she wore that. I would never wear that. Yeah, I think that all the time. No, you know, the thing is, do you then take that person and you slightly devalue them because of what they wore? Or had any thoughts like these, you know, like you see someone who's just horribly self-congratulatory or self-promoting, and you kind of get frustrated and bothered by that person. And you think, man, you are so full of yourself. Why don't you just go bow down and worship yourself in the mirror and, you know, spare me your Hindenburg-sized ego. You know, and I find myself doing these kinds of things. Or ever classified someone and then kind of devalued their status, discounted their value as a human. I mean, we did this in high school all the time, right? It's the way of high school. Oh, he's a jock. She's a slut. He's a burnout. She's a geek. He's a nerd. And of course, now nerds claim that they should be distinct from geeks. You know that? Yeah, nerds say that geeks are just smart about one thing, the thing they're geeked out about. Nerds, though, are smart about everything. Math, science, Klingon, everything. And if you have a point in the argument, you are definitely a nerd. That was kind of judgmental, wasn't it? Sorry. Don't imagine, though, we so easily grow out of these tendencies. They go with us into life, where we label people and then suddenly devalue their personhood. You know, Christians, unfortunately, have become more associated with the judgmental attitudes of the religious leaders of Jesus' day, more so than Jesus, who was called the friend of sinners, right? You know, like I've told you before, we recently did a study with the Barna Group of American Christians. And you know, we found that 51% of American Christians, when asked about their attitudes and actions, 51% told us that their attitudes and actions actually align more with those of the religious Pharisees than with those of Jesus. And yet we're blind to it. We all judge. But why? And how do we overcome it? Well, the first why, I think, is to help ourselves feel better. You know, C.S. Lewis refers to the fight to be in the inner ring. He talks about how it happens in every society, every school, every club, every workplace, every church. Everywhere there are groups of people, little groups form where you are either inside or outside. You're never voted inside or outside, but you know if you're inside or outside, right? And we all want to be inside, and ironically, once we get inside, we forget about those outside. Which, heads up, people in our church, we do the same thing. We forget what it feels like to be on the outside, and we forget to go and meet people and help them get connected to others. We got to keep an eye for that. It's so easy to lose. But Lewis talks about how as we grow older, the names of the groups change, but the dynamics stay the same. There's this desire to be in the inner ring, and there's a terror of being left out. And that's what causes us to start to judge and place each other. Our fear of being left out. So think about it. You know, in money or status circles, what's the first question asked at a party? What do you do? Right? What do you do for a living? And the answer puts you in a slot in that person's mind. Either this is a person I should know or be known to know, or this is a person that I don't need to pay more attention to. And there's this little light switch that flicks on. You ever seen this? Ever done it? It's a natural way of humanity everywhere. Or if you're in academic circles, we judge by degrees or tenure status. Or if you're in business circles, by revenue amount or corporate ranking. In social circles, we judge by background or material status. In the hood, we judge by whether you're a homeboy or an outsider, right? In white-collar circles, we judge by corporate status. In blue-collar circles, we judge by whether you can do anything useful with your hands, whether you can fix anything. In churches, we judge by whether you say the right words or do the right things on the outside. Never mind what's in your heart. See that? It happens to us all. We all judge. You know, at a Comdex Computer Expo a few years back, Microsoft's Bill Gates compared the auto industry with GM, with the car industry. He said if the car industry had kept up with technology like the computer industry had, we'd all be driving $25 cars that get 1,000 miles to the gallon. GM didn't like the comparison and wrote back and said, yeah, but how would you like your car to crash twice a day? Okay, now actually I looked that up on Snopes for fear that some of you would judge me. If that's an urban legend, it is, all right? So it's not true, but it is funny. So don't judge. But we all judge. The problem is that we're not very self-aware of how often we do and why we do. We do it to make ourselves feel better because we don't fully rely on God for our sense of worth and value. And the second reason we judge one another is to distance ourselves from the truth about ourselves, from having to look honestly at ourselves. You ever notice that sometimes the most critical, judgmental people are not very good at taking feedback or criticism? We all struggle with this, right? It's easier to see what's wrong with that other person than it is to really look and be willing to change ourselves. I mean, you ever sat here listening to a message thinking, I sure hope my spouse is listening to this. Or I wish my friend were here to hear this. Right? And you're thinking about that. You're not thinking about, God, what do you want to tell me? We all do this. Every married couple knows that their spouse has been far more inconsiderate than they have. It's just the way of life. Every child knows that his brother or sister was far more the start of the fight. Every worker knows that their coworkers are far more shifty and lazy than they are. It's like bad breath. We can smell it on each other, just can't tell when you have it. It kind of stinks, doesn't it? Freshman in college was there filling out a form to be placed with a roommate. And in it they were asking, you know, your own character traits, questions like, do you consider yourself a neat person? Do you regularly pick up after yourself? Do you make your bed regularly? He checked yes on every box. And his mom kind of looked over, realized that none of that was true and said, why are you lying? He said, what? And have him stick me with some slob? Here's the thing we've got to realize. With the things we hate in others, we judge ourselves. With the things we hate in others, we usually are judging ourselves because it might be something that God wants to change in us, but we're just blind to. When we get angry with someone's impatient tailgating and then offer them helpful directions on where to go, does that mean we are never impatient in any situation? Oh, well, that's different. No, it's not. We're judging ourselves, see? Or when when our spouse won't change and we judge how stubborn and prideful they are, does that mean that we're always willing to change to treat them the way we would want to be treated? Well, that's different. No, it's not. We're judging ourselves. We need greater humility. This is what Jesus is getting at. Jesus is showing us the way that the world actually changes. If all of us would truly judge ourselves rightly and allow God to do his work changing us, everything about the world would change. And this is the important thing to realize. The portal through which heaven invades our world, the portal through which God's kingdom, will, and ways comes to this world is the portal of a humble, honest, willing heart. The world changes when God changes me. That's the only way it changes. And that's what Jesus is going to go on to say. Look at Matthew 7, 3-5. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? And this is hilarious if you picture it, right? How can you say to your brother, hey, let me get that little speck of sawdust out of your eye when there is a 2x4 sticking out of your own eye? Can you picture what he's saying? I mean, it's hilarious. And he says, you hypocrite, first take the plank, the log, out of your own eye, then you'll be able to see clearly to really help your brother. Remove the speck of dust from his eye. Jesus is saying, we're not very self-aware. We can be so blind. We complain about everyone else, but we don't see where we need to change. Like one guy said, I have autocorrect for my voice. It's called my wife. We so easily nitpick and nag and try to control and change the behavior of others, but we don't nearly allow God to do the same for us. So I want you to do a little experiment this week. And this will be really helpful if you'll do it. Every time you see something with someone else that needs fixing or changing or bothers you, stop and pray. God, show me any logs that I don't see that you want to take out of my eye. Change me as much as I want them to change. That is the path to live the golden rule. We got to start there. Now, let me just say this. Jesus, when he says, do not judge, he's not saying don't ever correct each other. Right? That's very important to understand because this don't judge gets misunderstood in our culture. In fact, Jesus later says in another passage in Luke 17:3, correct any followers of mine who sin and forgive the ones who say they are sorry. Think about it this way. Imagine if a parent were unwilling to correct a child, who is not willing to take responsibility for their life or who is always biting, their friends on the playground whenever they don't get their way. Imagine if the parent said, oh, well, live and let live. Who am I to judge that biting is wrong? And that child grows up biting like that, biting his office mates or biting his boss. How well is that going to work, right? Not going to survive in life. Might get thrown in jail. Did you guys read Valentine's Day in Chicago this year? A woman was so angry with her boyfriend, she bit his tongue off. Really happened, and now she's in jail. See? So don't do that. You gotta wonder about that one, right? Like, I don't care if it is Valentine's Day. Don't stick your tongue in an angry woman's mouth. Should be a proverb. Maybe it is. So look, when Jesus saw hypocrisy in the religious leaders who were claiming to follow God, he lovingly confronted it, right? And he tells us as well, don't just swallow any teaching you hear, be discerning, check things out against the scriptures, right? So if I say something that you think is not accurately revealed in the scriptures, challenge me about it, but do it lovingly. See, we're going to talk more about this next week. Don't miss next week, because it's very, very important to understand. How do we discern so we don't get led astray in all this? But that's not being judgmental. We are to point things out. We are to make judgments about right and wrong, okay? And even point those out when our friends or those who are claiming to follow Christ are doing things that are hurtful to themselves or each other, but we're not to do it in judgmental ways, i.e. devaluing their personhood, or in condemning ways, i.e. removing love or acting like they don't deserve God's mercy like we need God's mercy, or forcing. And that's what Jesus is going to go on to talk about. That we need to have humility and self-awareness and ask rather than force. So that's the next thing Jesus talks about, which, by the way, can be very confusing if not understood in context. Look at what he says in verse 6. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. That sounds random, doesn't it? And see, often Jesus' message is taken as these little sound bites and not seen in the whole context. But in the context of what Jesus is saying, he's not giving you ammo to say, oh, these people are just pigs. Leave them alone. That's not what he's saying. He's talking actually about helping and actually helping one another. And what he's pointing out is if you have something sacred or valuable, don't give it to a dog or a pig. They have no use for it, right? Dogs don't read the scriptures. Pigs don't wear pearls. And if you take the context of what Jesus is saying here about correcting and helping others, he's pointing out that if someone is not in a state to be helped and to listen to your wonderful pearls of wisdom, don't try to force it on them. It'll backfire. In fact, they may just turn and try to trample you. You ever had this happen? Right? I mean, this would revolutionize our relationships if we would pay attention to it, right? How many times have you wanted to change something in someone else, but what happened is you came across condemning, even though you didn't mean to. They weren't really willing to listen or to receive it, so you keep trying to force your pearls of wisdom, your truth, and what you want to see changed on them. And how did that work for you? Did it work? Did they finally comply with a willing, humble heart? No, and you don't either, because that's not the way you want to be treated when you're being corrected, you see? And that's what Jesus is pointing out. If we are people who try to force our pearls of wisdom on others, trying to control or change behavior, either with our many words or our nagging arguments or our threats to remove love or value, even if we have the best intentions, it backfires. That's not how people grow. That's not how people change. Those are the ways of the kingdoms of this world: condemning, manipulating, controlling, forcing. Here's why it stifles growth. Because we are taking responsibility out of their hands and out of God's hands, and we're trying to bring them under our control. Let me say that again, because that's really important to understand. The reason this doesn't work is we are taking responsibility out of that other person's hands and out of God's hands, and we're trying to bring them under our control. We might not consciously intend to. We might be blind to it. We may be filled with concern for them, but when we either use the method of condemning or of forcing, we're not respecting that person as a spiritual being responsible to God alone. You say, well, how do we help each other grow and change? Glad you asked, because that's the answer. Ask. Jesus is going to talk about the way of asking. Asking God first, and then asking of the other person. Look at what he goes on to say. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be open. Which of you, if your son asked for bread, would give him a stone? Or if he asked for a fish, would give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? And then he sums it all up. So in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. Jesus is talking about the power of the request. Jesus is basically saying this: look, life is too short to spend it constantly critical of others, trying to prove your own worth by judging others. Life's too short to try to ruin your relationships being critical or controlling or condemning. Trying to change people to get what you want. But life is also too short for us to not be involved helping one another grow into more loving, productive people. But that doesn't happen when we try to force our pearls of wisdom on each other. That happens when we request, when we ask, first of God. And we ask God to fill us up. God is a God who is good. He wants to give us good gifts, things that will truly fill our hearts and our spirit and our soul up so that we don't need to manipulate or control or get from everybody else. We actually have something to give. See, where the ways of heaven can then flow through us. So first we ask of God, and then we ask of the other person. Dallas Willard said it so wisely. He said, asking is the great law of the spiritual world through which things are accomplished, but in cooperation with God and yet in harmony with the freedom and worth of every individual. All right, so here's what I want you to try this week. Okay, if something bugs you or you find yourself judging or being critical or trying to control, ask. First, ask of God. Ask God, where are there logs in my own eyes that you want to take out? Help me see myself clearly and be as willing to change as I want to change that person. And then ask God this: God, where do you see the masterpiece in this person, not just the mud? There's a masterpiece under there, a person created in God's image. Ask to see that. And then ask God, how can I best love this person to benefit them the most, to help them become what you intended? And then go and request. Okay, go and ask of them what you're hoping will change for their benefit, for their good. And then you got to leave it in God's hands. You got to let God be the one to change them, and you got to let God change you to be able to love them even if they never change. That's how you live out the golden rule. That's how heaven invades earth. The best example I've ever seen of this, the power of Jesus' ways, comes through a couple here at Gateway who 13 years ago, they were done. They were in the divorce courts. They had I think 15 years of walls building up in their marriage, of her criticizing and condemning and trying to control his behavior to get him to be the perfect husband because she had heard growing up, she's not good enough and she'll never get the right husband and all this. But all that controlling didn't help at all. It just made it worse for her. She felt less worthy of love. And for 15 years, he passively, aggressively, would say sarcastic things and would withdraw and would overwork and hold on to hurt and bitterness. And the walls just built up between them until finally, in a moment of weakness, he hurt her as badly as she had hurt him. He had an affair. She was devastated. He was done. Filed divorce papers. Okay, now you sit there and you think 15 years, that's impossible, right? Impossible. Nothing could change that. And yet, in her brokenness, she finally turned to God and discovered his grace and his forgiveness. She'd already done religion. She had tried her whole life the religious way to prove that she was a good girl and prove she was worthy of love. That didn't work. But she began to receive and experience God's grace and his forgiveness. And she stopped trying to even save her marriage or fix him and started to just say, God, take the log out of my eye. Change me the way you want to change me. Well, over the next year, he started to see such a change in her that he actually started to attend our church as well. And he started to learn about God's grace and forgiveness. As a result, he cut off the affair. They both ended up getting into counseling to work on their own issues, let God take the log out of their eye. And as a result, they were able to actually begin to love each other as they wanted to be loved. Not only did their marriage heal, they found a love they had never had before. And for the last 13 years, they've led our Staying the Course in Marriage course here at Gateway to heal many other marriages. See, that is the power of the golden rule. But that is also the power of God.